Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about and looking at one of the chapters in Lopez's Religions of Asia that is in some way connected with the chapter in Esposito on indigenous religions. And the chapter from Religions of Asia is chapter 22, Teachings of the Spirit Medium, which begins on page 366 of Lopez's book. Now, what you may have figured out, perhaps, is why I have you read this chapter in association with indigenous religions. Now, this chapter does not talk in this chapter in Lopez, is not specifically related to any, quote, indigenous religion, unquote. The connection it has is that this particular chapter is the transcription of an interview with what chapter 2 of Esposito calls a shaman or a shaman. And thus I wanted you to get a sense of what it's like to interact with a shaman and what kinds of things that many shamans will do as part of their practice. Okay, so this particular chapter then deals with a shaman or shaman from the Chinese traditions. And to hear what's going on here, if you look at page 366, the book mentions right in the second paragraph, in Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, spirit mediums are visible and active religious practitioners. They are folk healers. More rarely, they teach religious ideas, drawing on a deep tradition of popular literature and the text. Okay, so the religious traditions that this particular shaman is associated with are the East Asian traditions of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And we're going to hear a lot more about those in further chapters of of Esposito. For now, a number of things that will help you to deal with this chapter is that in East Asian religious traditions, unlike most, quote, Western traditions, unquote, these traditions, these religions blend into and meld and mesh with each other, so that a typical East Asian religious practitioner of these religions will perhaps say, if you ask them, are you a Taoist or a Confucianist or a Buddhist? They may answer, yes, because the traditions have been together for so many years and so many centuries that they have melded into each other to an extent. And so that's one of the things that's at play in this chapter, because the spirit medium deals with doctrines that come from all three of those religious traditions. He talks about doctrines that come specifically from Taoism, he talks about certain aspects of Confucianism, and he talks about certain aspects of Buddhism. And that actually is one of the questions I'm having you address in your worksheet for this particular chapter. Okay, so let's go a little bit further into this. As is the case with many chapters in Lopez, the authors steer away from the most popular and most, or not popular, but perhaps the most common elements that scholars talk about when they just talk about religion in this area. So, for example, in Hinduism, Lopez has nothing about the Bhagavad Gita, which is perhaps the most important scripture in modern-day Hinduism. Instead, it concentrates on folk tales about one of the goddesses. And I think we mentioned at the very beginning that that's part of the rationale of this book, is that it's trying to go beyond the texts that are considered the most important, and instead goes down to the common practice of common people within that religious tradition. And along with that, at the very beginning of this chapter, it talks about the divide between scholars of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, and those who are considered the experts in it, even within that tradition. It contrasts those people with the people who actually practice it on the ground, with faith healers, with shamans. And we saw some of that also in the previous chapter when we were talking about the difference between Shinshu doctrine, which is supposed to be pristine, faith only, and the practice of real Shinshu people, which was somewhat different. Something of the same thing is going on here in the divide between the experts, whether they be priests or ministers or even scholars academically. The difference between them and who actually practices the religion among the common people. And this chapter as well goes into that. Another thing it does in the section on spirit mediums from 367 to 368 talks a little bit specifically about the way that these East Asian shamans work. They call them spirit mediums here. For these spirit mediums, they will often combine elements of all three different religions, even as we've talked about just a moment ago. And one of the things that they practice, and I think Esposito mentions this with shamans as well, is that they they move away from the normal realm and through a number of techniques become one with the spiritual realm. Oftentimes shamans will channel the spirit of a particular deity, a particular god or goddess, or a particular force of nature, for example. And the same thing is happening with this spirit medium and the spirit mediums that this chapter is talking about. And it gives a little bit more detail about that. It talks about how much of the time these spirit mediums will channel either a literary god or a martial god, a god who is interested, or goddess who is interested in war. And it talks about how different that will be among those different gods and goddesses. It also talks about how most of the gods and goddesses that are channeled by these shamans are the most popular and have been presented in a number of different popular ways. Many of these deities, and this is on 367, also appear in folk opera, films, even comic book renditions. In trance performance, the shamans come alive as individuals. The deities come alive as individuals with well-defined personalities. And it talks about some of the different gods and goddesses that typically the shamans will channel. And so on one point there, the shamans are channeling these particular East Asian deities, who are also very popular in East Asia as well. So again, we get the notion that this is popular religion. This is not ivory tower religion. Also, toward the bottom of the page, it is said, the last paragraph, the first line of it, it is often commented that the god speaks a literary form of the language spoken in Malaysia, usually Southern Min, which is described as a deep version of Southern Min. And that is part and parcel of the shaman's channeling of the deity. The change in vocabulary, the change in expression, the change in meaning. And the difference between regular Min, regular Southern Min, and this deep Southern Min that is spoken when the shaman is in trance is the difference between an antiquated form of the language and the contemporary version. Okay, some of you may have studied Shakespeare, either in high school or in English literature class. And those of you who have read Shakespeare are aware that his wording, his language, the way his characters speak is much different than contemporary language. Something of the same thing is going on here. The shamans speak like Shakespeare, whereas the common people speak like modern people. And that's one of the characteristics of the shaman's performance. And by performance, I don't mean act. By performance, I mean something done. one aspect of the shaman's presentation, which also serves to legitimate and to some extent demonstrate that the shaman is actually channeling a deity, channeling someone who is different than him or herself. Okay, so that's part also of what's going on. Another thing that's going on, which is mentioned in this section called Text and Performance, from 368 to the end of the introduction, has to do with some of the characteristics of Chinese texts, especially Chinese religious and philosophical texts. And that is the fact that oftentimes these texts are written in a way that is abbreviated, a way that needs to be interpreted, a way that lends itself to different understandings. You might think of it in terms of American poetry or English poetry. Sometimes certain phrases are said that within them pack a great deal of meaning that goes deeper than simply the words. And they're driving at that kind of thing by talking about the condensed nature of Chinese religious ancient texts. And so that the shaman not only speaks the texts, but also speaks an interpretation of them, an explanation of them that has credibility for the clients of the shaman. It also mentions how oftentimes these shamans will talk about subjects of, I think they use the word cosmogony and morality. Cosmogony means a description of the beginnings of the world, of the creation, if it's a creation story. And the shaman will often start by reciting that kind of story, and then will also often talk about certain elements within the doctrine of the particular religious tradition, and then also speak about his or her understanding of morality, and how in the current situation that morality is either transgressed or upheld. And so a lot of that you'll see in this particular section on 370 to the end of the chapter 375. This is actually an interview with the shaman. We don't get to hear questions on the part of the interviewer. Instead, all of it is the shaman speaking, a transcription of what he says. And he begins with what is called the Great Ultimate. And this is a story of the beginning of the world according to traditional Chinese religion. The ultimate of non-being produced the Great Ultimate. The Great Ultimate opened heaven and earth. Heaven and earth produced creatures, then mankind, animals, and so forth. And that reflects back on a traditional Chinese understanding, or East Asian understanding, of the beginnings of the world. The beginnings of the world happened from what is here called the ultimate of non-being. And it doesn't quite mean out of nothing. What it has to mean instead is something that is so beyond our understanding, beyond the universe, that the only way to think about it and talk about it is the ultimate of non-being. And that produced the Great Ultimate, which produced heaven and earth. And in another description of this, the Great Ultimate produces yin and yang. And then from yin and yang spring a number of what are called trigrams, symbols. And the combination of those symbols and the different combinations of yin and yang produce the rest of the elements of the earth and eventually all the creatures of the earth. And so this text begins by a rehearsal of creation, or rather the rehearsal of the beginnings of the world. And another thing I wanted to point out at the Begadim in 370, in brackets at the end of the first paragraph under the Great Ultimate, he broke from his narrative to express his uncertainty as to our motives in wanting him to teach us. So, in other words, what this the author is saying is that the shaman starts by talking about the doctrine of creation, but then he stops talking about that and directly addresses us. So it would be like if I was describing, let's say, the story of creation in Judaism. And then I stopped and said, well, you know that, I think, but then again, maybe some of you don't. And so I have to say it again because I don't know who knows it and who doesn't. So he kind of breaks that fourth wall, if you will, and speaks directly to the person who's interviewing him. And what he says to that person is rather interesting. I must influence you and help you. I don't know your heart in doing this. I don't know if you are good or bad. I can tell you how to behave, how to worship, things like that, and then I can influence you. In some ways, that might be interpreted as being a little bit condescending toward the person who's interviewing him. And as I mentioned in one of the questions, keep in mind that he is being interviewed by Jean DiBernardi, who is a Western, female, modern, contemporary person. So, number one, it's not his culture, someone from outside his culture. Number two, it's a woman. And number three, it's a person who, according to him, hasn't lived through his experience. So there may be some condescension going on in the way he talks about her and to her. And on 371, he gives a number of different descriptions, rather not jumbled either, but descriptions that start and then go someplace else and then come back to the first subject. So his speech is not well organized like a speech would be if you had written it out. Instead, it's something that he's just talking to them about. And like most conversations, it goes back and forth from one subject to another. Then he talks about some of the doctrines of the different religious traditions. And he talks about Dao Li. Dao, D-A-O, being the same as the word T-A-O, Taoism. Dao meaning the principle of everything that is, that cannot be described, but can be attained to. And that's just a simple way of talking about it. But you'll hear more about Dao, the Dao, when we go into Taoism. Li, the word Li means ritual. But it means ritual not simply in the sense of a particular thing you go through, like you have a birthday, you get a cake. Ritual in the sense of the way you interact in the world. According to ancient Chinese thought, everything you do with each other and with people basically, in some sense, is a ritual. Okay, for example, when you meet somebody, you, quote, introduce yourself. And you do that by saying, for example, hi, my name is something or other. That's a ritual. In days before COVID, sometimes you might shake someone's hand. That's a ritual. And so ritual, in the sense that East Asian religions understand it, is the way and the patterns you use for almost all of your interactions. And the things he talks about, some of the doctrines relate specifically to the different religious traditions. Tao, of course, relates to Taoism. Also, for example, he talks about the term filiality, or filial. Let's see, where is this? Yeah, filiality on the bottom of 372. And filiality, the basic meaning is respecting and honoring your parents. And that concept is perhaps the most important virtue in Confucianism. Everything comes back to respect for your parents. Respect for your parents bubbles over into the way you treat all of your elders. It bubbles over into the way that you treat authority. It bubbles over into the way that you yourself are willing to sacrifice certain things for the good of others. So filiality, or the virtue of caring for and honoring your elders and your parents, is of the essence of Confucianism. So when he talks about filiality there, he is again hearkening back to the religion of Confucianism, just as he harkens back to the religion of Taoism when he talks about Tao Li. Also, on 372, he talks about desire, and this is the fifth paragraph. When people come to be born, they have sin, and we repay our sins. We have sin and we have desire. Now, in some ways, you might think of desire as something good, because according to him, the only way you get reincarnated is because you have desire for the world. But keep in mind that in East Asian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so forth, reincarnation is not a goal. Reincarnation is not something good. Reincarnation means you flunked your last life, and you have to go back and repeat it until you get it right. So desire traps you in that cycle of reincarnation. And also in Buddhism itself, as we'll come to know when we talk about Buddhism, for Buddhism, one of the Four Noble Truths is that all suffering is caused by desire. The only reason you suffer is because you want something to be different. So, for example, if you cut yourself and you feel pain, you have a desire not to feel pain. And thus, the desire is what causes the suffering, not the pain itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It sounds strange, but there is a way to understand that, and we'll talk more about that when we get into Buddhism. So again, the shaman harkens back to the use of ancient Chinese texts, harkens back to the three religious traditions of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And also, later on in this rambling discussion, he will talk about morality in a very clear way. And he talks about morality, as we mentioned, this is part and parcel of the way that these shamans often operate. Their subjects deal with the origins of the world, some of the doctrines of their religious tradition, and questions of morality, or of good and evil, right and wrong. And he harkens back to a traditional East Asian tradition that, and this tradition happens in other religious traditions as well. Children are not fully responsible moral agents. So, for example, when a child hits another child, you say to the child, "Don't do that," and you may grab their wrist away, but you don't put them in jail for assault. So children grow and learn in morality. And the way this works out here is that parents take responsibility for their children's actions. And the bad things a child does are in some ways the responsibility and the fault of the parents. So here it talks about when you are 1, 2, 3, and 4-year-olds, your parents bear 8 parts of your sin. In other words, for your parent, when you are that young, your parents are 80% responsible for what you do. And that goes on in decreasing amounts. When you're 5, 6, 7, 8, your parents bear 60% of your responsibility. Until finally, when you come to be an adult, you bear all of the responsibility. So that again is part of question of morality. Later on, he talks about other questions of morality, and he again talks about filiality and respect of elders. This is what he's talking about at the bottom of 373. The filiality is very deep. You cannot repay your parents. If men follow them and please them, then this is good. You must do things to please them. You must follow father, follow mother. You must not oppose heaven and earth. To follow, you must recognize that your parent, he is big, you are small. He is the elder, and in a certain instance, he is wrong. He is the one who taught you and raised you, and now clearly he is wrong, but he is still right. Okay, maybe some of you have experienced or come across an incident where a parent is talking to a child about not doing something, and the child says, "Why can't I do this?" And the parent says, "Because I said so." That's what this is talking about. In some sense, this virtue means you defer to your parents and your elders, even if technically speaking they are not correct. And part and parcel of that is the virtue of respect and the concept of respect. Even in this culture, it is often considered not appropriate for a person to criticize and correct someone who has authority over them in the presence of others. You take the other person aside and say, well, technically that's not quite right, but you don't do it in front of other people because you don't want to embarrass them. That's the kind of thing they're talking about here. You don't embarrass your parents. Even if technically they're wrong, they're still your parents and you owe them respect. And then it talks about, he does have a very low opinion of human morality and human following of morality. He talks about the different animals, and he says, they honor their parents, and we don't. They do things right, but we don't often do that. He says, even a bird honors its parents, and we don't. So his understanding of human nature and human morality is, to some extent, very pessimistic. And then one thing he talks about at the end of the chapter has to do with how he understands contemporary morality or contemporary society, contemporary culture. And on 375, in the second full paragraph. Now I tell you not to hurt people, but you defy me. You say, no, you don't want to hear this. I say, don't go and steal. You say, if I don't steal, I don't eat. But heaven will not starve people to death. You want to have your needs satisfied. You want to have your children eat. For every blade of grass, a drop of dew. In other words, what you do comes back to you. But you want to do things like that. You tell him not to, but he wants it like that. He definitely wants to be a success. These days, people are like this. Do it now. Get it now. It's okay now. These people say that if you do good, then your children get nothing. If you do bad, then they will get something. And that's kind of like what would in this culture be talked about as a cutthroat kind of capitalism. In other words, in order to make an omelet, you have to break eggs. In order to rise to a position of power, you have to do bad things to other people who are beneath you. In order to rise to a particular status, you have to throw somebody else under the bus, so to speak. And this is what he's complaining about. And traditionally, one of the virtues in Chinese tradition as well is that, and we'll actually see this in another chapter, in order to be a good person, good business person in a traditional Chinese village, making profit is not the only and the most important goal. The most important goal is to do whatever you do to the best of your ability. So in other words, if you make cabinets, you are supposed to make the cabinet to the best of your ability and then sell it for a fair price. And they say that is the true success. Whereas in some cases, what it happens is you make the cabinet as quickly as you can, no matter if it's crappy quality. And then you sell it for as much as you can get. That's the kind of thing he's complaining about here. That the greed for profit, and he uses the word greed a number of times, the greed for profit, the greed for money, the greed for goods, is something that is more a symptom of moral decay. And then he talks about it, he uses a particular term, this is a gold dash money world. If you murder somebody, you can fix it so that there's no trial by bribing and selling and getting the best possible lawyer money can buy. The money is given to you by fate, in other words, if you inherit it, and in a gold money world, money buys a life. It is true. If you have money, you can murder people. A gold money world. And at the end of the chapter, he mentions something that has to do with language. He says, let's say there's a cup. And a rich person will say, that's not a cup, that's a glass. And a poor person will look at it and say, no, that's a cup. Everybody will go along with the rich person and say, yeah, that's a glass. Because the gold and money, the riches and status are what create truth. And again, he's criticizing this and seeing this as ultimately bad and ultimately a system of the utter decay of morality in contemporary culture. Okay. I haven't seen any questions in the chat. So I'd like to ask you if you have any questions, either about this chapter or about the chapter in Esposito on indigenous religions, or about the assignments for this particular module. And I'm not seeing any chat. I'm not hearing any people. There are still, yes.
I think I'm all set at least. I think this one was a lot easier than the first chapter.
Okay, I'm having trouble hearing you. So can you say you're basically okay with everything that you've heard?
Yeah, I'm okay with this one. I think it's a lot easier compared to like the last chapters we just did. So I feel like this one
Yeah.
was a lot better.
Yeah, the last chapter, especially in Esposito, was setting up certain concepts that he's going to use throughout. And I do admit that the chapter in Lopez was rather difficult. But the reason I chose it is because it is an example of some of the things that Esposito is talking about in terms of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. I have a question in the chat. Can you explain what Tao is again? The reason I'm laughing is because the basic text of Taoism is called the Tao Te Ching. And the first sentence in it is, whatever you say about the Tao is wrong. So in other words, the Tao is something that cannot be truly explained. Some of the ways they talk about it in the Tao Te Ching is that the Tao is the mother of everything that is. You can also think about it as the underlying principle on which all things evolve or develop. You can think of it as the life force. You can think of it as something that is in everything, that characterizes everything, and that is still not identifiable with any one thing. If you've read any Greek philosophy, I don't expect that you may have, but if you have, you may have come across the term logos, which is something quite similar to the way Tao is used in Taoism. The logos being the underlying principle, the underlying logic of everything that is. The word logos in English becomes logic, even though the word logos is translated as word. And coincidentally, you get that in Christianity too, in John's Gospel, where he says, in the beginning was the logos, the word, and the word for John's Gospel became flesh in Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, so no, I can't really explain it. I tried to repeat basically what I said about it before. I hope that suffices for now. Okay, does that suffice? Are there other questions about that? Oh, if you've seen the bandage up here, nothing bad, no accident. I just had to have a carpal tunnel procedure done, and not a big deal. It happened yesterday, and right now I'm actually doing very well. Um, Very simple, very easy. So, that, in case you're wondering, that's why I have this bandage. Any other questions or comments either about this or about anything else that we've dealt with so far? Yes, I can explain what will be in the midterm. Actually, I need to go back for a minute to Canvas. The midterm is an open book take-home exam, as is the final. And the midterm, uh, let's see here. The midterm is actually available on Canvas now. So you go to the assignments tab, and then you just click on midterm exam, and there it is. This is actually the midterm exam, open book, take home, and you basically submit it as you do any other assignment. It's due June 17th. Does that kind of address your question, or did you want something more specific? Have you looked at it and have questions about it, or were you just, let me see how you worded that, chat. Yes, okay. Yeah, that is the midterm. And that's what's on it. So right now you can look at it for yourself, and if you do have questions about it, again, it is due June 17th. So we have we have some time before it's due. So if you come up with questions about it, we can talk about them in the upcoming sessions. When's our next session? Our next session is going to be, right. Okay, wait a minute. Go back to announcements. Okay, the next session is going to be June 11th and then June 15th. So we have two in-class Zoom meetings between now and the time the midterm is due. Okay, any other comments, questions, or about this or anything else that you might be asking about?
I have a quick question regarding the assignment for this module.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have a pretty good idea of going over the chapter on everything else, but could you go over, the question is discuss the role of the possessed spirit medium in interpreting sacred text. Would that be like when they're actually like feeling the spirit and then being able to interpret that to others that you went over?
Basically, yes.
Okay.
Again, in the chapter, it talks about how the difficulty of Chinese sacred texts is the fact that they're condensed and that they have to be interpreted in order to understand them. And that the spirit medium, because the spirit medium claims to be channeling the God, who is in some sense the author of the text, their interpretation of the text becomes more important and more reliable or credible. So that's kind of what's going on there. Does that address your question?
Yeah, that was kind of what I was getting. I was just wondering if there was any other point that I might have missed on it.
Not really. Yeah, it has to
Okay.
do with the nature of Chinese texts and the way that the spirit medium, by channeling the god or the deity, has a way of interpreting them that becomes more authoritative for some people.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay, it's about 8:45, so we'll stop here. I'll stop the recording.